Hi, my name is Barb Nangle. I'm the founder of Higher Power Coaching and Consulting. I want to welcome you to my podcast, Fragmented to Whole, Life Lessons from 12-Step Recovery.
This is episode 50, Q&A from listeners. Since this is my 50th episode, I thought I'd celebrate this milestone by answering questions from listeners. There are a few people who contact me regularly, so I thought I'd see if they wanted to send me questions to answer. I've done the best I can here, and I hope that at least someone gets something out of my responses. Here goes. First question, the person says, quote, all or nothing attitude I struggle with every day. I don't do a lot of things because I can't finish or do it the way it needs to be done. What can I do to help with this mindset? End quote. Great question, and it's something that I still struggle with from time to time. I used to suffer from this all the time, but I honestly didn't even know it while it was happening. So the good news for you, B, is that you actually know what's going on in your mind. I had no idea what was going on in my mind before recovery. So good for you. Your mind is telling you this isn't good enough, or it's not going to be good enough, which probably could be translated to I'm not good enough. I'm here to tell you, B, that you are good enough. You were created on purpose, by love, in love, for love. And it's actually not serving you or the world to have these thoughts. And I'm not saying that to give you yet another reason to beat yourself up. I'm not saying that. I am saying that so you can see what's going on. You can control what goes through your head. Just because you're having a thought doesn't mean you have to believe it. Now that I think of it, it sounds like what you've got going on is a combination of perfectionism and black and white thinking, which I've also heard called all or nothing thinking. There are a number of factors that went into me getting past these kinds of thinking. And one of them was having people point out to me things like, there are other options, right? But having people point things out to me was only able to happen when I started sharing with other people what was going on in my brain, and then asked other people for their input. This was extremely difficult for me in the beginning because I was always incredibly self-sufficient before recovery. Learning to reach out to others has been an incredibly wonderful gift of recovery. What I've learned is that help is awesome. I love help. If you need support in learning how to reach out to others and ask for help, I talk about that in episode 9 because reaching out is my number 3 tool of recovery. It's been incredibly important to my recovery in general and to this kind of thinking in particular. This is also one of the reasons that having a sponsor is so helpful to me. When I run my thinking by my sponsor and she says, well, what if it's this instead? It helps me to see a different perspective on things. And once I get to see that there is at least one other perspective on something I'm thinking, I then remember there are probably 7.5 billion perspectives on things since we all have different perspectives, and that there is a high probability that my perspective is not correct. Just a word of caution here, learning that your perspective is not correct, or at least might not be correct, is info, not ammo. That is, it's information for you to integrate about yourself. It's not ammunition for you to beat yourself up. It's info, not ammo. Another thing that's helped me with this kind of thinking is seeing it in other people. It's much easier for me to see when other people are thinking in black and white terms. They have an idea about something and assume it must be true. That is, they make things mean things, which is something I've done my whole life, and recovery has helped me to see that. Being in meetings, listening to others, talking on the phone on outreach calls has helped me to hear other people's thinking in such concrete ways. This is especially evident when we use words like always, never, have to, must, and should. One way you can counteract such thinking is by changing the words you use in your mind. Instead of always or never, try sometimes. Instead of have to, I love using get to or choose to. Instead of must and should, I like to substitute the word could. Here are some examples. Instead of I'm always last, try thinking sometimes I'm last and sometimes I'm not. Instead of I never get my way, try sometimes I get my way and sometimes I don't. Instead of I have to do my step work, try I get to do my step work. Or instead of I have to go to my mother's every Sunday, try I choose to go to my mother's every Sunday. Instead of I should go to a meeting tonight, try I could go to a meeting tonight. Try those on and see what happens in your brain. See how it feels to try on these new, less all or nothing phrases. I often didn't know that I even had choices about various things before recovery, and I talk about that in episode 46 on choice versus control, as well as in episode 32, freedom from choice, which is one of the greatest freedoms I've experienced in recovery. It also sounds like B is talking about perfectionism in her question, and perfectionism is really about fear. The idea is I'd rather do nothing and avoid failure altogether than try to do something and not achieve perfection. And I think that is really rooted in the idea that we care more what other people think about us than we think of ourselves. We feel the need to appear perfect to other people because we think that's what they want. So we have these really high standards, often for ourselves, but probably also for other people. And they're standards that no human could ever live up to. I know this because that was me. I had exceedingly high standards for myself. Like I wasn't supposed to have any flaws, but of course, knowing that I actually did have flaws, the next best thing was trying to hide them, which is largely responsible for me being fragmented before recovery. I had all these facades up to try to appear perfect to others. But once I started to realize I'm flawsome, which I learned in recovery, yes, I'm flawed, but that doesn't take away from me being awesome. Once I learned I was flawsome, I was able to relax into my life. And interestingly, once I let go of the need to appear flawless to others, I let go of my unrealistic expectations of others as well. I became more accepting of others and their flaws. And I was then able to be vulnerable with people and to allow others to be vulnerable with me. And I think that ultimately what this goes back to is really valuing ourselves. I think for me, coming to really understand who I am, what I'm like, being right-sized in terms of how I think about myself really helped me cut myself a lot of slack. And it also helped me cut a lot of slack for other people. I had really high standards for myself, and I also had them for other people. And it was partially because I was comparing my insides to other people's outsides. As I started to realize it's okay for me to be flawed, it's okay for me to share my flaws with other people, I started to be a lot more accepting of other people's flaws and stopped judging other people so much. As you can see, these issues are extremely complicated. We come into recovery with a lot of issues that are all tied up together, black and white thinking, the perfectionism, that are based largely on caring what other people think about me and less of what I think of me, not being right-sized, etc. It all goes together. And for me, personally, the solution to all of that is the 12 steps of recovery. As I've noted many times in this podcast, I've tried all kinds of methods of self-improvement. And even though some of them caused me to have some insights, maybe a little growth here and there, for me, the 12 steps are where it's at, because that was the formula that I followed to really change all of these things that I'm talking about and more. Now, I know the 12 steps of recovery aren't for everybody, but they are for me. And the whole reason I started this podcast is that there's a lot of wisdom in the steps, even for those who don't want to participate in a 12-step program of recovery. The next question is whether I know of any suggestions on boundaries with your own kids. B says, I don't want mine to struggle, so I made things easier for them. Now I wish I would not have done this. Well, B, I am not a parent myself, so it's difficult for me to talk about boundaries specifically for parents. But I do feel like I can speak to having developed boundaries as a result of my recovery. And honestly, just like I mentioned in the previous question, learning to care more what I think of me than what other people think of me was really the crux of me being able to develop boundaries. There's a lot of different things that went into me developing, enforcing, and maintaining boundaries. There are a lot of aspects of recovery that really contributed to me being able to have boundaries. And part of caring more what I think of me than what other people think of me has to do with self-esteem. For those of you who've been listening for a while, you know that that's not really something I struggle with typically, but sometimes I do. In fact, just last night, I had some thoughts bubble up to the surface that were pretty shitty. What's good is that the thoughts came into the light so that I could see them. So here's what happened. I'm going to share two different thoughts that I had in the last 24 hours. But first, you need to know that with the COVID-19 quarantine situation, all our meetings, probably like yours too, are moving onto the phone and onto Zoom. And our intergroup sent out a notice saying, here's the update of all the meetings in our area. I responded to the email thanking the intergroup chair and the webmaster for their service. And I said, you're saving lives. And then when I sent it, here's the shitty thought that I had afterwards. I thought, when they see this reply, they're initially going to think, oh, great. What the fuck does she have to say now? What is she going to tell us now? And then when they open it and read it, they'll be pleasantly surprised. That's an expression of gratitude. Then the second thought was last night after a meeting. The chair texted me after the meeting to thank me for wrangling the people from the conference call onto the Zoom call, as well as for everything else I do. And my thought was, she's just saying that because she's my friend and she thinks it's the right thing to do, not because it's true. Now, I had no idea these thoughts were lurking underneath my consciousness. So even though most of my conscious thoughts are about how great I am, or how if everyone just listened to me or did things my way, in other words, arrogant, it's really just a cover-up for I'm not good enough, or I don't matter, or nobody likes me. I don't want to think those things, but I do. The beauty of recovery is that I've learned that those thoughts are not true. This is why I've learned that I need to talk to my brain more than I listen to my brain, because my brain is full of shit. It's full of all kinds of shit that I've internalized over the decades. And it's my responsibility as a person in recovery to recognize this is BS. What's the truth? I've been hearing the healers out there say, if you're going to listen to the news and all the chaos that some are predicting, be sure to balance it with at least as much loving and healing and uplifting info. If you're going to listen to the news for an hour, then be sure to spend at least an hour either reading uplifting material or recovery literature, meditating, talking to positive people, reading uplifting posts online. The same is true in your brain. You need to counter the negative stuff in your brain with at least as many uplifting messages as you have negative ones. And if you've had that negative audio going for decades in your head without any filter, that means you're going to have to very purposely put positive thoughts into your brain. Most of the time, I struggle with the other side of the coin, where I tend to feel kind of arrogant, or I don't feel arrogant, I think arrogant thoughts. And my take on that is it's just the other side of the coin. One side of the coin is you're not enough, or you're not the right amount of something. And the other side is you're too much. Either side, you're just not the right amount, or you're just not right. You're defective. There's something wrong with you. Now, there's something else about caring more what I think of me than what others think of me that I've come to realize over the last few months or so. And that's that when I say I care more about what I think of me than what other people think of me, it has to do with my integrity. Now, I care more about being an honest person of integrity than I do about having a chance that you might like me. So what I'm talking about is this. In the past, I would lie to get people to like me. My main way of lying had to do with people pleasing. For example, somebody would ask me, would you help me with blah, 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 blah. And I'd be like, oh yeah, absolutely. No problem. Don't mind at all. I'm happy to. And many times I really didn't want to. I just didn't have the wherewithal to say no. I kind of didn't even feel like it was an option. Can you recognize the black and white thinking there? It, quote, wasn't an option. What I've come to realize was that I cared more that I could have a chance that they would like me than I did about being an honest person. This was all subconscious. This was not conscious by any means. I didn't even know that I was lying, or didn't even notice I'm a liar. DENIAL. As a result of my recovery, I've come to understand that integrity has to do with being whole. We integrate, and therefore we have integrity. I was not whole. I was split off. I was fragmented. And I also didn't know where I ended and other people began. When it comes to boundaries, there's so much that goes into it, but the bulk of it is you care more what you think of you than what other people think of you. And you realize you deserve to, you get to have the kind of life you want to live. You don't have to do things you don't feel like doing. You can choose to do things for other people. But if you feel like you must do them, or you have to do them, or you don't have a choice, that's a problem. And I think it is especially sticky situation when you're a parent and you're teaching your children how to be in the world. If you don't assert boundaries with them, not only do you not have boundaries with them, you're teaching them not to have boundaries and not to respect other people's boundaries. So the best thing you can do for your family is recover. That's the best thing you could do. You need to create your own boundaries, be your own person first in your life. And from there, you will start to set boundaries with your children and other people. It will happen organically because once you start having a sense of what it's like to live your life on purpose, the way you want to live it, which is what boundaries are about, then you're not going to want to give that up. It's a process that happens gradually over time. When I first started setting boundaries, I just didn't know how to do it. I had to experiment. And sometimes I was way too harsh. I was like, wham, slam down that boundary. And I'd realize, oops, that was a really harsh boundary. Maybe it was a little too much. Maybe I should back off on that a bit. But I didn't know that until I tried. It's something that you have to experiment with. It's not possible to suddenly one day be able to have boundaries. It's something you have to practice and get better at. Another thing to know about boundaries is that they change over time. It's not like, here's my boundary and it's going to stay there for all time. That's not how it works. Your boundaries are going to change with different people, in different settings, and over time. For example, I have certain boundaries with someone when I first get to know them, and then as I get to know them better and build a relationship with them and build trust with them, my boundaries are going to relax around them because I'm going to trust them and I'm going to let them closer to me. I have several other episodes that I talk about boundaries in, and I think it might be helpful to you to go back and listen to them. There is one that's called Getting Out of Enmeshment, which is episode 27. There's another one that's called Boundaries During the Holidays, which is episode 35. And in that one, I provide some actual scripts for what to say to people to set limits. And there's another one, which was just 2 weeks ago, that is Boundaries of Self-Containment and Boundaries of Self-Protection, which is episode 48. Before I move on to the questions from the next listener, I want to tell you, because it's relevant to what the questions they were asking me, is I have gone back and listened to all of my podcast episodes recently in preparing for this 50th episode. And I gotta say, it was really helpful. I actually did it twice and I find them very helpful, even though I know all the stuff, obviously, because I said it. And many of the things are things I say all the time to other people in recovery. But you know how sometimes when you're sharing with a sponsee or a fellow and you realize that you're saying what you need to hear? That happened to me a lot while listening. So I go back and reflect on these things all the time because there are certain principles that apply in recovery all the time. Now, on to the questions from the next listener who sent me a whole bunch of questions and comments. One is this, quote, "Your 50th podcast will be a year after your first. Do you go back and listen to specific podcasts and notice any differences such that you say, I'm not sure that's true anymore. I wish I hadn't said that. Or man, I can't believe I didn't talk about this." End quote. There was nothing that I listened to that I thought, I'm not sure that's true anymore. There's nothing I wish I didn't say, except maybe that I say fuck pretty often. And I do kind of worry about that. I've only had one person that mentioned that to me, that I don't need to use that word so often. Most people who mention anything at all about me, not actually most, everybody except for that one person that mentions anything about me swearing, they actually say they appreciate that I do because it connotes a certain authenticity and a certain amount of honesty from me, which is interesting and kind of cool to hear. In terms of other things that I was surprised I didn't talk about, there's only one thing that comes to mind, and that was from the episode 16, Denial, DENIAL, Don't Even Notice I'm a Liar. And I ended up doing another episode that I called Denial 2.0, which was episode 23, because the story I told in number 23 was the epitome of don't even notice I'm a liar. And that was the story I should have told in episode 16. The story I did tell in episode 16 was kind of lame and not that great to illustrate. Well, it was kind of lame as an illustration of the concept. It's not that it was a lame story. And the interesting thing was the story in episode 23 didn't even occur to me to tell it when I recorded 16, which perhaps is a result of denial. I have been in denial for so long that it seems like it's a well-worn groove in my mind. But what caused me to tell it for 23 was that one day I told the story to somebody on a phone call and I went, oh my God, this is the story I should have told about denial. So I feel like I cleaned that up. That's really the only thing that comes to mind. The next question is whether I have any regrets. And he was asking really in regard to my podcast. And I said, no, I really don't. I've never been the kind of person who has regrets, and definitely not in terms of my podcast. Then he says, I've listened to your story and the specifics you related about why you were doing this. And I hope I understand what you said, but I wonder what you feel about it now after a year after you started. Is it ever a chore? No, it is not a chore. It feels like a calling to me, not a chore. There have been a couple of times where I have a couple of topics I'm tossing around, and it's just not coming to me which one I want to choose or what exactly I want to say. But what happens in terms of the podcast most of the time is somebody will say something to me, or I'll have a conversation and I'm like, boom, that's going to my podcast. Even though I have a list that's like 3 fucking pages long of things I want to talk about, when I go to that list and look at it, often I'm like, nothing here is just pulling on my heartstrings. So it's really not a chore. I feel like carrying the message of recovery is a calling for me. I was born to do this. I believe that I have recovered so that I can carry the message. Just a note on my language there. I know there's a debate in the recovery community about whether people are actually recovered or recovering. I don't want to enter into that debate. I don't really know how I feel about that. I think for the purposes of my statement, that saying I've recovered so that I can carry the message makes more sense than saying I'm recovering so that I can carry the message. Next, he asked if I feel an obligation to do it now for my fans. No. First of all, I don't think of people as my fans. I think of them as my fellows. And as I just said before, I don't feel like it's an obligation. It's a calling. An obligation feels like something I'm pushed to do, whereas a calling feels like something I am pulled to do. His next question is it all a personal journey? Is it part of your business and livelihood? And if it is, how cool is that, having a livelihood linked to recovery? As I have just said a couple of times, it's a calling, which I would say is part of my personal journey. However, my business is higher power coaching and consulting, and I think of this podcast as an arm of my business now. But honestly, that is not how I thought of it when I started. When I started the podcast, it never occurred to me that this would really have anything to do with my business. In the intro to the podcast, from the very beginning, I've said this is Barb from Higher Power Coaching and Consulting. And I think I originally said it kind of as a way to legitimize myself. I'm really not even sure. But I've actually gotten some clients from listening to the podcast, which was amazing to me that happened, because it never occurred to me that would happen in the beginning. The next question, how positive has the response been? Do you get people commenting disparagingly? And if so, how do you feel about that? And how do you deal with it in terms of your journey of recovery? I've never looked at any of the comments anywhere online. I don't even know if they're there. So I've never received any negative comments. The only comments I've gotten have been positive, and they're either from people that already know me and have my contact information, or were savvy enough to dig up my contact information and contact me because they were so grateful for what they got from my podcast, which is just amazing. I'm so glad that the podcast is helpful to others. What's amazing to me is not only do I get the amazing gift of healing and recovery for myself, I get to magnify that gift by sharing it with other people. What that means is it makes my pain and what I went through worth it. I can hopefully save someone else some amount of pain from the work that I have done. And if I could ease just one moment of one person's pain, then my life has been worth living. And I already know that I have done that. And then in terms of negative comments and what would that mean in terms of my recovery, I haven't gotten any, but I am really clear that what other people think of me is none of my business. He goes on to say, I love your candor and the way it's sculpted in the King's English. You obviously have an eloquent command of the language, and at the same time, you come across as down to earth, even a little salty at times. I love it. Is this who you've always been, or is it more an honest reflection of Barb since recovery? I definitely feel like I am much more comfortable in my skin as a result of recovery. I feel like I have sort of been boiled down to the essence of who I am now. I would never describe me the way that you have described me, Kay, though I think it's accurate, and it's really hard for me to answer that question because I'm talking from the inside of myself. But I do feel like I'm more me than I used to be. I guess I would say I was a diluted version of myself. So I guess I've always been this way, but maybe I'm more concentrated now. And then he says, not that it's all important at all factually, but as I've thought about your podcast, I've thought about something that I figured out a long time ago in my career. A lot of time, it's not about what you say, it's about how you say it, especially when everybody in the room is smart. Did you have to change how you were to be so cool in your podcast? For what it's worth, I don't think so, at least not much. No, didn't know that I was cool. In my podcast, this is who I am. You are literally hearing exactly who I am. This is what I talk like. And actually thinking about that, one of the cool things about having this podcast is that I have a couple of friends who don't live around here anymore, and they listen to my podcast and they tell me it's really cool. It's like I'm still around because I'm talking to them and I'm talking exactly the way that I always did with them. The next person here with questions says, here are my thoughts for your 50th episode. So thought 1. 12 stepping an issue/problem. So I think what she's asking about is a process that I learned in one of my fellowships where you apply all 12 steps to a finite problem. I've led workshops on this process because it was something I learned pretty early on in recovery, and it was extremely beneficial to me then, and it sometimes still is. It's kind of equivalent to do an autopsy of a relapse, which I've heard other people use in other fellowships. It's also equivalent to a 10th step turnaround, which I've heard of in other fellowships, where you take a pretty finite issue or problem or whatever, and you apply all 12 steps to it. It's much too long for me to go into here, but I can tell you right now that it's an incredibly effective tool. When I have something that's a really difficult issue for me, if I take it to 12 Stepping a Problem worksheet, I'm usually able to really unlock things. The first time I did it was early in my second fellowship, and it was during the time I was doing the 4th step inventory in my first fellowship. And just by doing the worksheet in a meeting, I was unable to unlock my brain to the point where I was able to see my part in a way I hadn't before. And it enabled me to add over 10 more defects of character to my step 4 inventory I was working on. I was astonished at the power of that process. And it also gave me a good idea for what to expect from the steps as I move forward. Because it's one thing to read the steps on the wall in a meeting. It's another thing entirely to work through those steps with a sponsor or a step group. I've used 12-stepping a problem worksheet a number of times. And one of the things I've realized when I go back and look at all my previous worksheets that I did is that 100% of the time, I'm the problem. Like there's either an unrealistic expectation that I have, a defect of character I'm acting out of, or a lack of clarity or lack of communication on my part, or something like that that has caused the situation. If any of you are really interested in this, you can probably Google it and find it in some fellowship website. But if you can't and you want me to send you a copy, just email me. My address is barb@higherpowercoachingandconsulting.com. Yes, I know that's an incredibly long URL. All right, question 2 is grief versus depression versus unmanageability. So yeah, this is a toughie. I have dealt with all of those, and I'm going to tackle unmanageability first. My understanding is that my life was unmanageable because I was trying to control the uncontrollable. That could be addiction, that could be compulsion, but mostly unmanageability comes from me trying to control that which is outside myself. Remember, you can only control what's inside your hula hoop, your thoughts, your behaviors, your beliefs, how you treat people. It's when we get into the territory of trying to control things we cannot that our lives become unmanageable. This is why the serenity prayer is so important and so powerful. It reminds us that our higher power is going to help us with understanding the difference between what we can and cannot change. And a note on the serenity prayer, I believe it's a little bit backwards. My experience is that I get serenity from acceptance. I don't get acceptance from serenity. When I accept this is what's happening, or life on life's terms, I get to have serenity. And another thing that I want to say is that the serenity prayer is really a prayer about boundaries. What's in my territory and what's not in my territory. Now, on to grief versus depression. So there is some distinction between the two, of course, but there's also a lot of overlap between them. I'm going to give you some background on me so you'll know for sure that I understand both grief and depression, as well as the lovely combo of the two. So here's part of my story. On St. Patrick's Day in 2006, I was diagnosed with depression. I'd had episodes of depression before, but I didn't know that they were diagnosable, medicatable, like capital D depression. And I remember saying to the psychiatrist, "Are you telling me that my brain chemistry has changed?" And she said, "Yes, absolutely. And in fact, what happens is the chemicals in your brain are assaulting you, and you need to go on medication to stop that assault. It seems clear that you have had episodic depression, that is, episodes of depression as opposed to chronic depression. And that what you need to know for the rest of your life is that when another episode comes along in the future, you need to get on medication as soon as possible. You need to stop that onslaught, that assault of chemicals, because it will get worse and worse and worse over time if you don't go on meds." This was wonderful news, of course. So I went on medication and it was really helpful. And 3 months later, my younger brother died. He was only 35. He was 8 years younger than me, and he was dual diagnosis with a severely debilitating bipolar disorder and a substance abuse problem. Go figure. He died of Legionnaire's disease, which is a respiratory illness that only about 5% of people who get it actually die from. But he had a severely suppressed immune system, partly because of his really bad depression, partly because of his substance abuse problems, and partly because of his physical health problems. And he really did not take care of himself and really just didn't want to live. Thank God I was on antidepressants when it happens. I couldn't imagine having gone through his death without them while being depressed. I ended up getting on additional antidepressant and eventually a sleep aid as well during that time. I felt like that grief very seriously exacerbated my depression. And about that grief, his was the first close death in my life. My grandparents had died previously, but that's sort of the natural order of things. And also, they lived far away. So it was almost like I just wasn't seeing them. It wasn't really like they died. So it's not that I hadn't experienced death at all. It was just that he was my first close death. He was also only 35 and he was my little brother. So it was my first real in-my-face encounter with mortality. And he was someone I was very close to. And it's just not the natural order of things that your little brother dies before you and that he dies at the age of 35. So it was a really, really tough one on me, and I was really, really depressed. In fact, what I've often said about that time is I became undone. I became undone. Interestingly, one of the ways in which I really healed from my grief over his death is that I watched every episode of the TV show 6 Feet Under. This was back when Netflix mailed you the DVDs and I would order them and binge watch that show, which was about a family that ran a funeral home. So in every episode, there was at least one, if not 2 deaths. And I got to see a wide variety of ways in which people dealt with grief because all the different characters in the show had different ways of grieving. Whereas I had felt like I have no idea how to grieve. We do such a shitty job with grief in this society. And I remember saying to my mom around that time, I feel like I want to become a grief activist to promote grieving. I don't even know what that is. I made that up because I just didn't know how to grieve. I eventually came to understand there is no right way to grieve. There's no right timetable for grief. There's no right amount of grief. Everybody grieves differently. And even the same person grieves differently in different circumstances. My own example is that my whole life, I always thought the worst thing that's ever going to happen in my life is my mom dying. Wrong. It was my brother dying. Because my mom died 6 years after my brother, and it really wasn't anywhere near as difficult for me as it was losing my brother. I think part of that has to do with it's the natural order of things that our parents are older than us and we expect them to die at some point. Though I didn't expect her to die at the age of 73. I really expected her to live at least until her 80s. But anyway, my point about talking about the grief and depression is that I experienced my worst grief in my life while I was depressed. However, when my mom died, I was not depressed. So I've had grief without depression. I've had other episodes of depression where there was no grief involved at all. So I know the difference between being just plain depressed, just plain grieving, and the lovely combo of both. There is a lot of overlap between grief and depression, but usually for grief, there's something that is really concrete reason for your grief. You typically know why you're grieving. For me personally, I can look back now and say really all of my episodes of depression were because I was trying to pretend something. I was either trying to pretend that I felt things that I didn't feel, like in love with somebody, or I was trying to pretend I didn't feel things that I actually did feel, like attracted to somebody. Every single time I was depressed, there was a man involved. And it was because I was extremely codependent and not really clear about who I was, where I began and ended. And I did not have the capability of communicating directly with people. I couldn't say things like, hey, I'm really attracted to you. Are you attracted to me? And then gotten an answer and responded appropriately. My codependent people-pleasing ways meant I also didn't want to hurt somebody's feelings by breaking up with him. But what's really crazy is I can look back now and see that I stayed with them and it was awful for them and me, but I somehow thought that staying in an awful relationship was like protecting them from not hurting their feelings. Yet I was probably treating them like shit, or at least being an asshole to them. My point is that the source of the depression or the grief is usually very different, but sometimes it can feel exactly the same. Extreme lethargy, lack of desire to participate in things that used to give you joy, deep sadness, feeling like the feelings are never going to end, lots of shitty audio files going through your head. Now, back to unmanageability, which can mean so many things. I believe I've given a great example of how unmanageability can lead to depression. I tried to control the uncontrollable, that is, other people, by my people-pleasing, codependent ways. And what I got was depressed, trying to pretend I felt things I didn't and didn't feel things I did. When feelings are meant to be expressed, not denied or submerged. My life was unmanageable because I didn't know who I was. I didn't know where I began and ended. I didn't know how to engage in direct communication and say things like, hey, I'm attracted to you, or are you attracted to me? Or this relationship isn't working for me anymore. And so my life was unmanageable. The last question she has is how to make healthier decisions. And I think that this really boils down to giving a shit about yourself, which is at the core of having boundaries. Like caring more what you think about you than what other people think about you. I think giving a shit about yourself and treating yourself well and kindly is what recovery is all about. We treat ourselves well, we teach others to treat us well, and we teach others to treat themselves and others well in recovery. I made a lot of unhealthy decisions, and it was often because I cared way more what other people thought of me. I cared way more about what they thought about everything. And so my good self-care practices went out the window when I was in a relationship. Making healthier decisions for me included a lot of different things, including reaching out both to my higher power and to my fellows. Asking people's opinions, because me self-willing my way through my life didn't do shit for me. So I need to run my ideas by other people, whether it is other fellows in program or by a sponsor or a close friend or a therapist or a clergy person. Really understanding what I like and don't like, what I want to do and don't want to do, what my preferences are, helps me make healthier decisions. Then there are some decisions that everybody knows are healthier than other decisions, but they're still making unhealthy decisions because they're doing something like buffering their feelings, perhaps eating lots of sugar or doing drugs to coat their nerves. I used to live the kind of life where I needed to coat my nerves, and I don't live that kind of life anymore, so I don't need to coat my nerves. So it was hard to make healthy choices of not coating my nerves when I was making all those other unhealthy choices, like bending over backwards for people and making myself overstressed and overwhelmed, trying to control the uncontrollable. What I'm realizing here from my answers to all these questions is that boundaries are an exceedingly important part of healthy living and of being in recovery. And then there's having a higher power and really believing that there is something, some force, some spirit, some divine presence, some energy, some principle in the universe. It doesn't matter what it is, as long as it's more powerful than you. believing in something that is more powerful than me, that will always be more powerful than me, and will be able to handle things I can't handle, has made all the difference in the world. I pretty much felt responsible for everything before recovery. And even though I believed in God before recovery, I didn't use God the way I do now. So when I turn my will and my life over to the care of God, primarily what that means for me is I turn my thinking over, because my thinking was the problem. And so now when a problem comes up, of course, I often at first go like, oh my God, what are we going to do? And then I'm like, oh, that's right. I don't have to figure it out. God is going to figure it out. I don't feel like I have to fix things anymore. And that has taken an enormous amount of pressure and tension out of my life. So yes, boundaries are extremely important. But the real key to my recovery is this absolute reliance on a higher power. And having that means that I have this really deep and profound trust that I'm going to be okay. Everything isn't going to be okay, but I'm going to be okay. And I think I'll end with that. I hope this has been helpful to you and you've gotten all your questions answered in a way that was helpful. Namaste.
That's it for today. If you like what you've heard here, then you just might be interested in private coaching with me. If that sounds like you, head on over to my website, which is higherpowercoachingandconsulting.com, and click on the contact menu. I'd be happy to schedule a consultation with you to help you make lasting changes in your life, like I've made deep, lasting changes in my life. My ideal client is someone who is ripe for change, but I'll coach anyone who wants to be happy, joyous, and free. So if that's you, shoot me an email. I'd love to hear from you. Thanks for listening. Be sure to like and subscribe so you can be sure to get future episodes of my podcast. Thanks again.